For those of you who are not fully familiar with the energy community, this is an international organization based on a treaty. It's been in place for more than 15 years now, and we focus on helping the Eastern Partnership countries, well, three of them, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, and also the Western Balkans countries, to bring their legislation and policies in line with the European legislation policies, legislation and policies. Um, for for a long time, energy has been the heavy part of the energy community. It was based on energy, on the integration of energy markets. But in the last 5 years, the climate considerations and the share of climate in the activities has been continuously going up. So today, if we move to the next slide, I will highlight to you a few examples of that are relevant for climate mainstreaming, and I will give you a bit more details on the first two pillars, on the targets, 2030 targets, and the governance regulation. These are the current obligations which are most relevant to climate. So the Energy Community 2030 targets, governance regulation, and the third one, which you have heard today from some of the countries, the monitoring, reporting, and verification of greenhouse gas emissions on an installation level. So this is the precursor for the introduction of a carbon pricing regime. Now let's move on to the next slide, and here you can see the targets. These are similarly to the EU targets of greenhouse gas emission reduction, share of minimum share of renewable energy, and energy efficiency. They were all adopted last December at the Ministerial Council meeting. There is a headline target for overall the energy community, but also individual targets for each contracting party. These targets are an integral part of the different legal acts in the energy community and the contracting parties. So they are part of the governance regulation and the directives on energy efficiency and renewables. On the screen, you can see these are the targets for greenhouse gas emission reduction. And on the next slide, you can see the targets for renewable energy and energy efficiency. You will get the slides, so you will have all the figures at your hand. Let's move on. The governance regulation. So this is identical to the EU governance regulation with certain adaptations. So for each legal act which comes from the EU to the energy community, there is a process to tailor make it to the contracting parties, but without changing the main content. The energy community governance regulation should have been transposed by the end of last year, which means that it has to be integrated in the national legislative system. And this is a very complex task. We are aware of it. It requires amendment of existing legislations. It's usually the laws on energy and climate. In some cases, it requires drafting new legislation, and you have seen this morning that some of our countries are now drafting framework laws on climate. And of course, it also requires the drafting of a lot of secondary legislation because it contains many technical rules. The governance regulation is the first legal act that brings in the climate angle into the energy community. But it is also the first legal act which substantially expands the scope from energy. And the reason for that is because it also in the EU, it aims to create an umbrella, you may call it mainstreaming, across the different sectors. And you can see it on the bottom of the slides that it really covers all the main elements of the national economy. Let's move on. Obviously, the NECPs, the National Energy and Climate Plans, are the highlights, the stars of the governance regulation. Usually people speak about these plans, but there are also other important elements. So the first one is the obligation to establish a system for reporting on policies and measures and projections. Uh, in general, the reporting dimension of the governance regulation is very strong and has, and I'm sure that my colleague Jan will also mention this in his slides, it is a very essential element to know how the countries are progressing with their claims. So far, the emphasis has been on making commitments, making declarations, and now with the governance and related acts, this is complemented with a massive reporting framework. So there will be a very close monitoring also in the energy community, how the countries are progressing with their pledges and their earlier projections. Another element of the governance regulation is the greenhouse gas inventory systems. This is not something new. In fact, it has been there at the precursor of this legal act, which was called the MMR regulation. And we see that in this part, in fact, our countries are pretty well advanced in terms of transposition. We have also seen that EU for Climate has given substantial support to the countries related to the inventory systems, and it's very important because this represents work already done, so that you don't need to start it from scratch. This year already there are some obligations in the governance regulation, and they relate to reporting on greenhouse gas policies and measures, on the adaptation planning and strategies, but also on other issues such as emergency oil stocks and revenues from carbon pricing. We are currently working with our countries to support them with this reporting. They report directly to the European Environment Agency. So with the help of the Commission and the agency, we use the EU infrastructure and resources to support the countries in this in the reporting exercises linked to the governance regulation. The last point is the long-term strategies, which again is coming from the previous version of the governance regulation, the MMR, and it used to be called low carbon development strategies, low emission development strategies. We all know that it's the same product. I've seen many of you have it, and there is an obligation in the regulation that indeed these strategies must be put in place and updated as appropriate every 5 years. They have a very strong link to the NECPs because these long-term strategies should cover a 30-year period, so they should address the really main avenues of policies. And if you will, the NECPs with its 10-year period can be very well considered as an action plan implementing the long-term strategies. So if the long-term strategy is the question of where we want to get, where we want to go, then the NECP should give you the answer, how do we get there in the next 10 years? Let's move on to the next slide. The transposition. For this, I would like to just share one more technical detail a bit how the EU legal acts are coming to the energy community. I already mentioned about the adaptations, so the acts are slightly changed, but the main elements remain. In the governance regulation, what is different from the EU version is that the Energy Community Secretariat does not act as the European Commission in the EU. We do not act as a courier, as a coordination platform towards the UNFCCC. So our contracting parties continue to submit and communicate their strategies, their communications to the UNFCCC directly. Another point is that in the energy community, we do not have uh, the legal instrument being directly applicable. In the EU, when there is a regulation and it's adopted, the countries do not need to adopt their laws to have these obligations in their national legislative framework because it's directly applicable. In the energy community, whatever is adopted, the countries on the top of that have to copy basically these provisions in their national laws and secondary legislation. So this is why we look at the transposition, and what we see is that there is no full transposition yet of the governance regulation from any contracting parties. We see, I mentioned already that the climate part and especially the inventories and the monitoring related to inventories is nicely covered. For instance, Moldova has very detailed rules on these with the two government acts. But all the other parts, especially related to energy, need to be added. Provisions on the NECPs are also sometimes kept in a very vague high level, and many of the technical rules are missing. And as I said, it is of course difficult to transpose, and this is a bit the trick when you try to take EU legislation that is directly applicable and go through the national legislative process, because the easiest way is to copy paste, but we realize that your national legislative culture may be different. It may be based on different principles. You may not just put a certain provision in that form into your law. Again, we are ready to help you, to provide you with input. If you send us draft laws, draft secondary acts, we are very happy to provide comments on it, because we know it's not easy. Last but not least, you've seen also in the presentation of Moldova today that it's not just the governance regulation, but in fact two implementing acts, which are part of the package. So one on global warming potentials and the other one on climate-related reporting. Let's move on to the next slide. You can see on this table some examples who is where, but I would suggest that we move on and you can check it at a later stage. We have quite several draft laws in the pipeline. Let's move on to the next slide, please. I will speak a bit more details about the national energy and climate plans. In the next slide, you will see that it's not a new story, because it has been around already 5 years now. So it was first in 2018 when the Ministerial Council of the Energy Community issued a recommendation to the countries to encouraging them to draft national energy and climate plans. And the Secretariat prepared guidelines which were effectively mirroring the provisions of the governance regulation, how these plans should look like, what the main elements should be, and what should be their function. And the work started thanks to the, let's say, political decisions on the country level, and also there were several support programs helping with the modeling, with the definition of policies and measures, etc., etc. But then we had COVID. All our lives were turned upside down. And after COVID, we had the economic recession, we had the inflation, we had the energy prices going through the roof. And countries were supposed to plan how the world will look like in 10 years, what they are planning to do in 10 years. And of course, if all this was not enough, there was the Russian aggression against Ukraine, which added yet another twist to the unpredictability of the situation. So I just want to illustrate with these examples that of course it is very difficult to know what will happen next year, how the economy will look like next year, let alone to plan until 2030. But we still need to do it, and in fact for this, the 2030 targets and the long-term 2050 climate neutrality actually can serve as the anchor, as the final point of arrival where we should get. So I would encourage you to keep this in mind, that even if the coming years might be very turbulent, in the NECP, see the NECPs as really the tools, the vehicles that will help you get to those 2030 and those 2050 milestones. What we foresee now is that by the end of June this year, we expect the draft NECPs from the contracting parties, and then we will have half a year at the Secretariat to assess each of them and provide some recommendations. At the same time, in order to boost the regional coordination, the contracting parties will present their draft NECPs to each other in the Energy and Climate Committee of the Energy Community. The NECPs should be adopted by June 2024, and after that, in 2025, there will be a biennial, so every 2 years there will be a reporting exercise called Integrated Progress Reports, where the countries will report on how they are implementing their NECP. This exercise is ongoing in the EU right now. So towards the end of the year, we plan to invite some member states, the Commission, to share their experience, how this reporting exercise in the EU has gone, so that we can all better prepare for 2025. In 2028, we will expect new draft NECPs from the contracting parties, which will need to be adopted by summer 2029. So it's a pretty long-term vision, but if you think of it, it will come very, very fast. Let's move on to the next slide. This is just a bit to illustrate that sometimes we feel that the NECPs are considered as a necessary evil, something, a burden that the countries have to do, and they just want to get over it, and that's it. But in fact, the NECPs are really an integral, a central part of the policy framework. And I would like to again reiterate that all the other sectoral strategies on forestry, on agriculture, on waste, on competitiveness, etc., should be aligned with the NECP. If you have a strategy already in place when you draft the NECP, then have a look at it with a critical eye, because if it's 5-10 years old, it might be rather outdated. Then you can use the NECP to propose some changes. And when it is adopted, that sectoral strategy, then make sure that it's adopted in line with the NECP. So anything which comes after the NECP should build on the NECP, and the colleagues in the ministries of environment or agriculture or other ministries which are not part of the NEC process now should be reminded that there is an NECP and they should take it into account. There is also a strong dimension for consultations. So all the draft NECPs must undergo public and stakeholder consultations. And at the end, at the adopted NECP, there has to be a summary of how these consultations were organized and how the input in the consultations has been taken into account. Sometimes, of course, it can be difficult, but it has to be done, and it has to be done. We have also another act in the energy community, which is the directive related to the Aarhus Convention, which sets out some main principles for the consultation. So you are discouraged to make a consultation in the middle of August for 2 weeks, posted on a website where nobody can find it, and just consider that you tick the box. So this is a practice not to follow. There are two other elements where we see that some improvement could be done. One is the regional coordination. And here, obviously, for the countries in the room, if you are directly neighboring each other, it's relevant. So I'm thinking of Moldova and Ukraine. When you have some policies and measures in your NECP, especially the ones which rely on your neighbor or which have an impact on your neighbor, you should consult with each other. in principle, you should exchange the draft NECPs with each other, but if it's a targeted discussion, that's also fine. In this sense, Georgia, in the energy community framework, is a bit of alone. So you, of course, you are encouraged to consult with your neighbors, but from our perspective, of course, we understand that it's a different consultation than for the other contracting parties. And the last point is that the NECPs, if you look at their timeline of 10 years, are located in between the long-term strategies and the NDCs. So obviously they have to be aligned with these instruments as well. Our suggestion is that you have the long-term strategy, then the NECP is aligned with the long-term strategy, and the NDC is aligned with the NECP. So when you start the process of updating your NDC for 25, I strongly encourage you to pick up your NECP, go through it, and use it for the NDC process, build on it, and improve it, make a more ambitious NDC compared to your NECP. Let's move on to the next slide. We can do one more click because there is an animation. So on this slide, you can see the different dimensions of the NECP: decarbonization, energy security, energy efficiency, internal market, and if you think of your own departments or your own ministry and other ministries, you can see that these pursuing your objectives in each of these fields separately can lead to some conflicts of interest, I would say, because if you pursue energy security, your main aim is that you have power plants within your borders emitting no matter how much. The main thing is that the lights are on. If you pursue decarbonization, you are concerned what those power plants are emitting and you want to reduce them. If you pursue market integration, trade, your main objective is to rely on the cross-border trade, to rely on cross-border infrastructure, to rely on cross-border energy flows. Then you may not want to build all the power plants in your border because you may realize that it might be cheaper and cleaner to import part of your energy needs. So this is just to illustrate that when you do the NECP process, there must be a discussion with the participation of all the ministries, with the participation of the decision makers, and there has to be some sort of compromise how the different sectoral policy objectives will be met. And it must be clear to anybody that nobody can get everything, so there has to be a trade-off. If you don't do that and you make an NECP copy-pasting everybody's input, then you will get a document which will not be consistent because it will want to go this way, but it will want to go the other way. And it's the worst that can happen because if an investor, if anybody reads it, they will have no idea what you really want. It will create uncertainty, and that's bad. Let's move on to the next slide. Yes, maybe 2 clicks even. More. Sorry, yes, it's yes. Thank you. I will not go through this on every single step. This is a summary of how the NECP development normally goes. On the top, you have the descriptive part. So this is the part of the NECP with a lot of text, with the story, with the narrative. And on the bottom, you have the analytical part with all the charts, with all the graphs, with all the figures, which is the output of the modeling. Normally, the two should be very closely linked. So when you say we have a target of X% of GHG reduction, and we do this and this and this, there should be a corresponding figure in the analytical part. And even better, there should be some sort of link that if you take out a couple of policies and measures because they prove to be unrealistic, then you should be able to tell yourself how much this will reduce your greenhouse gas emission reduction efforts. What is highlighted in the middle, and this is relevant for mainstreaming, is the strategic environmental assessment, or SEA. And this is something which the countries must do in addition to the NECP. So once you are drafting the NECP and once you have a list of policies and measures, you must launch in parallel the process of drafting an SCA. And what the SCA does is looks at your NECP, mostly the policies and measures, and checks to what extent these are, what impact they have on the environment, and to what extent they are acceptable, and what extent they may need to be changed, or what other mitigation measures are needed to make sure that there is no harm done. Uh, it's a very complex and a very dynamic process because the NECP is changing, and obviously the SCA has to react on those changes. And if the SCA says that a policy and measure is unacceptable or requires substantial mitigation measures, the ministries doing the NECP may decide, okay, then let's just remove it because it would be too expensive. So please pay attention to this, and even though it's very complex, and if you have consultations that may bring yet additional amendments to the NECP, which will require again the change of the strategic environmental assessment, but unfortunately that's how it is. So at the end of the day, the two documents should be fully in line with each other. The SCA should reflect on what is actually in the NECP, and in the NECP it should be reflected how the different policies and measures where the SCA has some opinion or suggestions, how those suggestions will be implemented. Let's jump to the next slide. A couple of points based on the lessons learned of the NECPs which we have received. We see the added value, and I think also the countries realize that it is good to have a single document in which you bring together all the different areas, the different policy objectives, and everything is put next to each other, because it can very well highlight the differences in the policy aims. The NECPs, also thanks to support programs, have very good analytical basis. So the scenario design is good, and we have really concrete figures on the trajectories and how the picture will look like with and without the measures. Now that the 2030 targets have been adopted December 2022, they also have to better steer or clear out if there have been some uncertainties on national level, which way you should go. You have a target, and that can help the understanding. It's important that the NECPs which are drafted now are fully compatible. They are the same structure, the same format as the EU NECPs, and they are adopted, well, from 2029, they will be adopted exactly at the same time as the EU NECPs. So the contracting parties will have exactly the same documents as the EU member states, and this will create a bridge between these two blocks, and it will create really comparable basis to look at the ambition of the neighborhood and the EU as well. And last but not least, the NECPs are essential for investors. We have spoken today about the investment needs for the green transition. There is a lot of money needed, much of which will come from the private sector. And a credible NECP in which you have cost estimates for the different policies and measures will help the investors feel safe to invest in your renewable sector, in buildings renovation, in other areas. A bad NECP or an inconsistent NECP will help to chase those investors further away. So have in mind that that the NECP is also an investment, has a function to promote investments. Now, what could be improved is obviously having a full overview of the NECP, reading it, and working on the consistency. So sometimes it's visible that the person putting all those different elements together got tired of copy paste and putting the same format, and there was no time or no energy to really read through and see whether it makes sense as a whole. Um, Also, the consultations and the inputs from the consultations are missing, but these are very essential elements, so please do include them. The cross-border impact, what the impact of my NECP on the neighbors are, uh, what impacts the other NECPs on my economy are, these are missing usually. So this is something which should be there, because again, you are not in a bubble. Your neighbors' actions and policies substantially impact you. Um, as I said, the NECPs should give you the answer to the question: how do we get there? How do we get to the targets? And when it comes to the difficult decisions, what do we do with coal-fired power plants? What do we do with some heavy decisions with coal mines? They are often just swept under the carpet, and there is no explicit plan. And this is difficult. Obviously, the NECP goes beyond the single government's mandate. And for politicians, it can be very difficult to understand that there is a life after them. But these things, sooner or later, will need to be addressed. And it's better if you give a realistic and credible plan, what you plan to do with those difficult questions. Obviously, nobody is expecting a country reliant on coal to, I don't know, 70%, to close down the coal mine in 2 years, dismantle the power plant in 3 years, and that's it. It's unrealistic. But if there is nothing, then of course it adds to the uncertainty. If there was a plan saying that we will launch some re-education programs, we will use revenues from other sources to help to improve the region. You mean these kind of measures give some security also to the citizens there, because otherwise they don't know when the sword above them will just fall. And last, please be concrete when you do an NECP, or if you do an NECP-like document, for those who don't have to do an NECP. Very general policies and measures do not really help. You know, stating that you will improve energy efficiency, it's nice, but you can do millions of things in that. So in the NECP, what we expect to see is concrete policies and measures. We plan to renovate the public building stock by 30% in the next 5 years. We plan to launch, I don't know, programs in the amount of X billion euros to help renovate private buildings in the next 10 years. We plan to do a tax break for purchasing electric vehicles, something like that. So the more concrete it is, the better, because in 2 years you will need to report on the progress. And if you had a very vague, fluffy policy and measure, you will not be able to report what have you done on it. So this is important. And I think that was the last meaningful slide, apart from saying thank you and happy to answer your questions.